Maryland basketball absolutely can still win the Big Ten.
You are Locked On Terps, your daily podcast on the Maryland Terps, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, everyone? I'm Trey Moore, host of Locked On Terps, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So thank you for making us part of your day. And I'm also doing work at Inside Black and Gold. So make sure you guys head over to insideblackandgold.net for all your latest Terps news. Maryland basketball, even though we're getting late, even though they're not a top 2 team in the Big Ten, I still think can win the Big Ten regular season title. Now, I'm going to start by saying this. Maryland basketball is going to need a little bit of help, but this is still very possible that I think that the Terps can win the Big Ten. It's not going to be easy. There's going to have to be really good basketball down the stretch, but I think Maryland basketball has every opportunity to be able to possibly win the Big Ten. I think this year we have put ourselves in position as one of the best teams in the Big Ten. You could argue Maryland basketball is playing like the best team in the Big Ten right now. How we played in our last 8-9 games, I think you could argue is the best basketball the Big Ten has seen so far. You could also say Michigan is playing at a really high level with a win streak of 6 games in a row. Wisconsin has a 5-game win streak, but we did end up beating Wisconsin in our matchup. But when I look at everything, if you would have told me before the season Maryland was 5th in the Big Ten today, and they also were 10-5 in conference and 20-6 overall, and the 20th ranked team in the country, I absolutely would have said that's a great spot for the Terps. But once you get to the top 5, top 4 team in the Big Ten, you got to start to get greedy. We can't just think about, oh, this team can be a really solid seeding in the tournament. This team can do some good things in the tournament. This team is the top 5 team in the Big Ten. I think Maryland might have the best starting 5 in the Big Ten. I argued that the other day. I said they have a top 5 starting 5 in the Big Ten. I don't know if anybody puts out a group that's better than Maryland's starting 5. And I say, why not try and win this thing? And I don't mean the Big Ten tournament. The Big Ten tournament is going to be a separate conversation. We're going to wait on that till the bracket comes out. I think the Terps can do that too. But I'm talking about today, can Maryland win the Big Ten regular season title? Something that's not easy to do, something that's very challenging. Only one of the teams, like 50 million teams now in the Big Ten, win that Big Ten regular season title. And you play a lot of games, and the standings fluctuate a lot, but there is very much a path for the Terps to be able to win the Big Ten conference. One thing is they're going to need help. Right now, they're going to need help. Maryland, the number 1 team in the Big Ten right now is Michigan with a conference record of 12-2. They're really the favorite by far. They're going to be the one that's tough to catch up with because they have to lose 2 games outside of you, which isn't going to be easy down the stretch for Maryland to be able to get to Michigan, to catch Michigan. Every other team Maryland's approaching very rapidly. Wisconsin's 11-4 currently in conference, and Purdue's 11-5 currently in the conference. But Purdue's on a 3-game win streak while Maryland's sitting at 10-5. Purdue's on a 3-game losing streak. They've kind of lost their status in the Big Ten as a team that put themselves in a really good spot to maybe be able to win it. And I think we should be able to pass Wisconsin as long as we take care of business on Thursday, which is another important game for Maryland basketball, is the game tomorrow, Thursday, against USC at home. That's a game you just can't drop if you want to be able to win the Big Ten. Now you look at it, and things can get weird. Michigan State play this Friday. So you need both of those teams to lose, but obviously that's not a possibility with both of them playing each other. But you really want Michigan to lose that game. That's going to be a huge game. That's going to be a lot of people in college basketball will be talking about that. Michigan is at home, but that's a big boy matchup that a lot of people are going to talk about. But you need Michigan to lose that matchup. If Michigan wins that matchup, you're probably out of it. So you do need some help. But I think it's very possible, and I think somewhat likely that Michigan State ends up beating Michigan. I think that's something that absolutely can happen. Michigan's been really good at home. They've been really on the road as well. But I do think there are some cracks on that team. I know they have a really talented big man duo. But if you get Michigan to move to 12-3 in conference, then you absolutely can do it. But Michigan State has to beat Michigan. And then if you're Maryland, you also have to beat Michigan on Wednesday, March 5th. And if those two things happen, you have a really awesome opportunity to be able to win it, I think. And you also would have to probably beat Michigan State, which is not easy, but you get them at home. So it's really, if the Terps want to win the Big Ten, they're probably going to have to win out. But I think that's entirely possible. Obviously, two talented teams that have played at a really high level, but I still think that Maryland on paper, and when we get to the lines of those games, could actually end up being favored in that type of spot against Michigan or Michigan State. I think at home against Michigan State, the Terps very well could be favored. We'll see how they play when they're favored, but I think they absolutely have the opportunity to potentially be favored against a Michigan State team. So you really have to win those two games, and then you need you're going to need Michigan to drop either the Rutgers, Illinois, Nebraska. One of these games down the stretch. They actually play Michigan State twice, which is actually huge. I actually didn't realize that when making this argument. But Michigan has to play Michigan State twice. So they play them once on February 21st, and you play them once on March 9th. So either you need Michigan to split those, or you need Michigan to go 0-2 in those. And then you can catch up to Michigan State. They're at 3 losses currently, but Maryland right now is at 5 losses. You can absolutely catch up to Michigan State. If they lose one to Michigan, if Michigan and Michigan State split, then they're 12-4, and then Maryland gets the opportunity to play them to get the header over them. And then if Michigan loses to Michigan State and one other team, they're going to be 4 losses headed into that game, and Maryland has a chance to overcome them and get that tiebreaker over them, which I think is honestly really possible. Is it likely? Probably not. But I do see a path where Maryland wins the Big Ten. And a lot of people might say they can't do that. That won't happen. And I would say, yeah, maybe it's unlikely, but I've seen crazier things happen. And I think Maryland winning the Big Ten and making a really big stretch down late could potentially put them in a really, really good spot to be able to do some good things for the Terps. My biggest thing still is that the Terps might be one game away from this. Like, really, they might be one game from winning this whole thing if things can shake up down the stretch like they want them to. If things go the way that they want them to down the stretch, they might be one win away from winning the Big Ten regular season title. Like, that might be how tight this race is at the end of it. And you just go back to some of those games that Maryland lost early on in the season, and you say, dang, man, they had every opportunity to be able to win this. You talk about the Ohio State game where we were up late in that game and we ended up selling it. Talk about some of the games early on against like a Northwestern, a game we should have probably won, against a bad Washington team that we took a loss to. There was just games where we had a win and we just didn't execute like we needed to. And that's going to happen sometimes. So you can't kick yourself too much. But I do think that Maryland might be one win away from winning the Big Ten. And a lot of people might look at it and say, dang, they could have won it. But at the end of the day, if we don't win the Big Ten regular season title, by no means is it the end of the world. People care about that stuff. People care kind of what happens in those situations. Obviously, you want to win the Big Ten, but you know what people care a lot more about? What you're going to do in the tournament, what you're going to do in March. People have a lot more to say about that. People have a lot more excitement around what you're going to do later on rather than what you do now. So I do think you want to talk about this, and it's going to matter for your March Madness seeding. But I also think the biggest thing is winning later on the season. And I think Maryland is in a good spot, kind of to peak right away for the Terps. They've put themselves in position, I think, to peak at the right time in March. And March is obviously coming up. And I think this team can even take another step and another level. But I do still think if Michigan loses a game that they're not supposed to lose, I think Maryland can win it. And Michigan State and Michigan potentially split, and Maryland can beat Michigan State and Michigan. I think they can win it. Now, the hardest part probably about that is beating Michigan State and Michigan. That's no easy deal. That's no easy thing. But I do think that that's something that possibly could happen for the Terps the way that we're playing, especially getting Michigan State at home and you get Michigan on the road. I do think that that's something that could end up happening for the Terps, something that won't be easy. But I'll be interested to see what happens. I do think that's entirely a possibility for the Terps. But I do think the Terps still have a real legitimate shot at winning the Big Ten. Let's talk about Maryland's pass rush. The Terps have a young group of guys next year, but I think they have some young guys that have a really high ceiling that can get things done that I'm excited about. We'll talk about that next. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was dealing with piles of paperwork and frustrating forms, and then waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back. Now Taxes is easily uploading your forms to TurboTax expert who's matched to your unique tax situation, an expert who's backed by the latest technology, which cross-checks millions of data points for 100% accuracy. While they work on your taxes, you get real-time updates on their progress, and you get the most money back guaranteed, all while you go about your day. No stressing, no worrying, no waiting. Now this is Taxes. Intuit TurboTax. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live Full Service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. So Maryland football's pass rush heading into next year, I think could have a couple young guys step up, and I think it's going to be really important. I wanted to talk about this because I feel like we haven't talked about a lot of football this year for Maryland football, but I do think there are some interesting kind of parts to this Maryland pass rush that I think are going to be big next year for the Terps. I thought last year our pass rush wasn't that good. I expected our defensive line unit to honestly be a little bit better than what it was last year. I thought we had good players. I just thought it didn't work out the way I kind of wanted it to. And I feel like Maryland's never really had a really good pass rush. There's a couple of things that I feel like every year are lacking. I feel like we always end up having good receivers and good players there. I feel like we've had good quarterbacks. We have had good secondary players. It never feels like we have standout guys in terms of pass rushers. It never feels like we have standout guys in terms of pass rushers. It never feels like we have good offensive linemen. So really the trenches, I feel like it never really works out for the Terps the way that we want it to work out. And I'm always saying you got to get bigger up front. We got to do different things up front. And I think Maryland's pass rush last year was a little bit disappointing. I thought it wasn't that great. I thought it wasn't that good. But here's my thing. I think we have some young guys next year that I don't know how exactly productive they're going to be, but I think we have some young guys that could be really good this year. But first, I'm going to start about the guys that are coming back that I think are going to be really good. So when you look at sacks last year for Maryland football, we just didn't get a ton of them. Caleb Wheatland led our team in sacks, and he's a middle linebacker with 4. And then Kellen Wyatt's a guy I'm really excited about next year. I hope he can take another stack. Was second on our team in sacks, but only had 3. So it's not like, he was second on our team in sacks and had 6, 7 sacks. He only had 3 sacks, 2 forced fumbles though. And so, excuse me, it's just a position that I think we got to be more productive out of. And I think Maryland got a couple of guys that I think are going to be really good. I think Trey Reddick can kind of play all over the place. I think he's interesting from a pass rushing perspective. I think Daniel Owens needs to take a step up. I do think there's guys that can pass rush, but we just didn't have a ton of sack production last year, to be frank. And I think we do need to work on that a little bit. And that's why I'm really excited about one transfer. I'll start with transfer D.D. Holmes. I'm really excited about the Florida State transfer. He's a DMV kid, and I think he's going to make an instant impact right away. If you remember, he was a big recruit out of high school, 4-star type of guy from Gonzaga, went to Florida State, had a really rocky year over there for Florida State. I'm not going to say specifically for him, but just for the team. Obviously, they just weren't that good. And I think he has all that attributes and length to play immediately for the Terps, get us hopefully a young body in there that can do some things. He's 6'6", 255. Like, he has all the kind of things you want in a young pass rusher that can really set him apart. And I'm excited to see exactly what he can be and what he can do off the edge. And I think he's going to be a really good player. He spent a year at Florida State. He's got a redshirt year, so we have him still for a while. And I think he can play. I think he'll absolutely play right away, but I think he'll be one of the starters right away on the defensive edge unit. I'm looking for a guy like Neo Avery, obviously, to step up, but he seems to never be healthy. And besides Kellen White, I don't see a ton of returning productions at that kind of outside linebacker, D-end type of spot. And then that also leaves space, I think, for the freshman, Zahir Mathis, who we picked up late, who's a 4-star edge, one of the better players in the 2025 class, ranked as a top 120 player in the 2025 class, has similar to D.D. Holmes, needs to put a little bit more college weight on him, but has all the attributes at 6'6", listed at 225, probably a little bit heavier than that by now on 247. I think those two guys are the future of our pass rush. I think those two guys potentially, not next year necessarily, but in the future, could be guys that could be 5-6 sack guys for us, and maybe even more. I just think that right now, kind of how it stood and how it's kind of been every single year, we just been lacking it. And it's tough to win games when you just don't really get to the quarterback. It's tough when teams get to your quarterback really easily, and I think a lot of Maryland fans would agree. Last year, people got to our quarterback pretty easily. Like, Billy Edwards would get hit a lot. I thought that was a big reason why his game kind of got messed up. I thought it's because teams were getting to him. And it wasn't that difficult. And then on the vice versa, on the other side of the ball, Maryland couldn't get to the opposing team's quarterbacks that much. So when I look at it that way, I just think that Maryland kind of needs to work on that overall. Is getting better at the pass rushing spot. I expect Kellen Wyatt last year to take a big step up, and he didn't really he took a step up, I would say, but it was kind of a small step up. But this year you add 2 young guys that I think are really talented. I think next year could be kind of a learning experience for them, and then the next year, going into the sophomore year, those 2 guys could really start wreaking havoc. Everybody wanted to hear Mathis, really talented player off the edge, one of the top players in Pennsylvania. So we're excited to see what he can be able to do, and I'm really glad we got D.D. Holmes. I think those guys are going to be really good compliments to our defensive edge, outside linebacker, whatever you want to call it, group. And I'm curious how the new defensive coordinator, whoever it is, comes in, kind of works with these guys and how he kind of implements these guys, and if it's going to be the same formation or things going to be a little bit different. I don't know exactly. I'm kind of curious to see exactly what happens with the Terps and kind of how it all works out. But I think it'll be interesting to see kind of what happens for the Terps and how everything looks. let's talk about Maryland loses a commitment because Coach Williams is gone. We'll talk about that next. So Maryland football lost the commitment from Brian Harris the other day. And I want to talk about this because it's not really about Brian Harris. I want to touch on him and losing his commitment because I do think he was a pretty good player. But a lot of it's about Coach Williams leaving and taking over at Jacksonville State. Here's my thing. Losing Brian Harris, 2026 recruit, is not by no means the end of the world. He was a decent player, it looked like, or a good player, 3-star rated player, 73rd defensive lineman, according to 247. But I did like his size at 6'4", 290, with still size to grow into, but also has the height, and he's still a really good size coming in, where you can add some really solid college weight to him, and I thought he would be a good player on the inside for us eventually. But it looked like he decommitted because Coach Williams took the Jacksonville State job. I don't know exactly. It looks like South Carolina's big on him, so it looks like he'll end up going there. Is kind of what how it looks like to me. He also has like NC State. He has Duke. He has some offers for sure. He's a really solid player. Of course, he had Maryland, Ole Miss. He had Penn State, West Virginia. Like, he had some O's for sure. But he's a guy that decommitted from Maryland after the Coach Williams thing happened. I'm still happy for Coach Williams. I don't know exactly what the deal is with it, because you just thought last year he was going to get, or a couple years ago, excuse me, he would get like a pretty big boy not a big boy head coaching job, but you thought he would be a head coach somewhere based off of how the Terrapins were performing and things like that. But instead he ends up at a defensive coordinator at Jacksonville State, which is just, quite frankly, I don't want to say a worse program than Maryland, but they're not as good as us. Not as big time, not a Big Ten program. But I want to take more of the recruiting perspective. Here's my thing. Here's a couple wishes that I have when I'm hiring our defensive coordinator. The fact that we don't have a ton of commits, I guess, in the 2026 class, but the fact we only lost one commit makes me feel pretty good about where everything stands. It sounds like the relationship with Mike Loxley is a big part of the recruits, and losing one is definitely not going to kill us, definitely not going to put us in a horrific spot. And I think I want a guy where we get him, recruits start to follow. I want to get a defensive coordinator that's like that, where it's like if we get him, a lot of people start to follow. And I remember when Nick Saban retired, and obviously Coach Brian Williams isn't quite like Nick Saban. Like, guys started leaving the portal. Like, Caleb Downs left. I remember that Julian Sain quarterback left. Like, guys will leave. And so the fact that Maryland's lost their OC and their DC this offseason, and we still really have maintained everybody in the recruiting classes and just guys that are at Maryland. It's not like a bunch of guys are like, oh, I'm out now. I think is really important for the Terps. And the fact that I want this new DC to be a really good recruiter. I think that's really what it comes down to these days. You got to know how to recruit. You got to know how to win these kids over in the weird day of NIL. You got to be able to figure that out. And I want somebody that's able to do that for the Terps. And I think that's going to be a big win for Maryland to win games, is being able to figure that out. The NIL, the recruiting, and things like that. I think that's something that the Terps really need to be able to do. And we'll see exactly who they bring in. But I do think that it's a good to get a fresh new start. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening to Locked on Terps. Make sure you like and subscribe. We're here every day talking Maryland football and basketball. So thank you guys for listening to Locked on Terps.